the missing heritability problem. It was a huge shock for molecular biologists because they thought genes would explain everything, and they don't. Proneness to breast cancer or liability to become schizophrenic or things like that on the basis of genomes. The predicted power was very low. The genome could only predict 5% or 10%. I think that a lot of what is not explained by genes is in fact explained by morphic resonance. Each species has a collective memory of form and instinct and behavior. The whole of nature has an inherent memory. The so-called laws of nature are more like habits. The normal view in biology is to focus almost all attention on genes and molecular biology, and then it's simply assumed that by complex interactions, they'll self-assemble. It's like saying the house will just build itself if you just shake up the building materials. That's not how it works. A house has an architectural plan, so I think that's the role that the morphic field plays, shaping the form, the behavior.
What is the role of the brain in the context of morphic field theory?
I think our minds stretch out like fields far beyond our brains.
How does it work? Do we really know, or it's a hunch still?
It's a postulate, a hypothesis. There have been various people who've attempted to explain it. For example, David Bohm, the well-known quantum physicist, thought that morphic resonance could work through what he called the implicate order, which is a hidden order that underlies quantum processes. What I'm arguing, you see, is that the mechanistic materialism, the current paradigm, is inadequate. What we need is a view of nature as alive. Nature is more like an organism than a machine.
Hello, Rupert. Welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time for this interview. Before we dive into main topics, I wanted to ask you, from a piano player like myself to you, who is also a piano player and an organ player, would you agree that God's creation of the world was to the sound of Bach's music?
Well, I wasn't there to see it, so I couldn't be sure about that. But I love Bach's music, and indeed, I've been playing some of Bach's music this morning. So that's mainly what I play on the piano.
Excellent, me too. So I would say that your favorite composer is the same as mine, which is Bach. Or would you say Mozart or Purcell?
Oh, no, definitely Bach.
Bach. We are Bach people. All right. Well, in my humble opinion, you need no introduction, but perhaps for people who are new on the blog, you could just say a few words about your background and your main research interest.
Well, I've started out my scientific work as a biologist. I studied biology and natural sciences at Cambridge. I did history and philosophy of science at Harvard before I went back to Cambridge to do a PhD, which was on plant development. I was then a research fellow of the Royal Society and a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, where I did research on the plant hormone auxin, 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 which is chemically indole acetic acid. I worked out how it's made in plants. It's made by dying cells. It's released as cells break down, and how it's transported in plants, the mechanism of the polar auxin transport system. Auxin moves from the shoots towards the root tips, and it's a polar transport system. It only goes in one direction. Then I worked in India in an agricultural research institute called ICRISAT, where I was working on the physiology of tropical legume crops, particularly chickpea and pigeon pea. Then all that time I was thinking about the nature of biological development and the nature of morphogenetic fields which shape form. And then I wrote a book on this in India. I left my job for a while and lived in a small ashram, a Christian ashram in Tamil Nadu with someone called Father B. Griffiths. an English Benedictine monk. And then the book was published in 1981 called A New Science of Life, putting forward my ideas on morphic resonance. And then I've been working on morphic resonance ever since then, but also on other areas of science that are relatively controversial, like telepathy and the feeling of being stared at. Really, topics which are to do with the extended mind, the mind being more extensive than the brain. So I would say that most of my work for the last 40 years or so has been on minds being extended beyond brains, both in space, through vision, for example, and in time, through memory, which is where morphic resonance comes in. So I basically do research in areas of biology and psychology, experimental research, which are neglected by many scientists, but which I think are very important for pointing towards a better understanding of consciousness.
Interesting. I have a book of yours, which is one of the early editions. And if you permit me, I'll just quote something.
Yes.
So the book is entitled The Presence of the Past, Morphic Resonance and the Habits of Nature. And here you write that living organisms inherit genes from their ancestors. According to the hypothesis of formative causation, they also inherit morphic fields. Heredity depends both on genes and on morphic resonance. So what is morphic resonance and what is morphic fields theory? And most importantly, what does this theory explain that genes, evolution by natural selection, and epigenetics do not?
All right. Well, those are a lot of questions. Basically, morphic resonance is the idea that there's a memory in nature. The whole of nature has an inherent memory. The so-called laws of nature are more like habits. Each species has a collective memory of form and instinct and behavior. And so how morphic resonance works, I think, is on the basis of similarity. Similar vibratory patterns in self-organizing systems lead to a resonance across time and space, so that a present system tunes in by morphic resonance to similar systems in the past, which convey a memory to it. So in the animal species, each species would thus have a collective memory. Every young antelope, for example, would be tuning into the behavior and the form of previous antelopes of the same species, tuning into a kind of collective memory. Humans do the same, and I think what Jung called the collective unconscious is best understood in terms of morphic resonance and collective memory. Because morphic resonance depends on similarity, it leads to a number of surprising predictions. And one of them is, if we think about our own memory, if we ask the question, who is most similar to me in the past, then the answer is me. I'm more similar to myself in the past than to anyone else. And the most specific resonance working on me from the past is from my own past. And I think that normal memory, when I remember what happened yesterday or when I was a child, as well as habit memory, remembering how to ride a bicycle or drive a car or play tennis or play the piano, I think all these forms of memory depend on morphic resonance. I don't think they're stored as material traces in the brain. Now, most scientists just take it for granted that memories must be stored inside the brain as material traces, even though these traces haven't actually been found, despite a century or more of looking for them, because they think that's the only possible way memory could work. Well, actually, there is another way, and it's morphic resonance, and I think it makes more sense of the phenomena of memory. Now, when we come to biological form, the idea of morphogenetic fields or form-shaping fields was first put forward in the 1920s by developmental biologists. And since then, it's been a minority view within biology, but it's been a very important view because it gives a holistic approach to understanding the development of form of an animal embryo or of a plant as it develops. Probably the leading proponent of morphogenetic fields who is working in contemporary biology is the American biologist Michael Levin, who speaks very well on the subject of morphogenetic fields. These fields are top-down causal systems. As a leaf develops, for example, I think there's, as it were, an invisible mold or pattern for the leaf that shapes the developing leaf. And as fields, they're intrinsically holistic. A magnetic field, for example, is completely holistic. You can't take a slice out of a magnetic field like you take a slice out of a cake. And if you cut a bar magnet in half, you don't get half a magnet, two halves of a magnet. You get two small but complete magnets, each with its own field. And so I think morphogenetic fields are like that, and they shape developing organisms' form. But the inheritance of morphogenetic fields doesn't depend on genes. Now, this was the problem I was wrestling with in Cambridge when I first thought of the idea of morphic resonance. How might these fields be inherited? Genes can't explain the holistic development of form because genes are all about coding for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. They give us the right proteins. They give every organism the right proteins, and some genes are involved in switching on or switching off other genes, which mean that they either make or don't make a particular protein. Some epigenetic forms of inheritance involve switching on or switching off genes which are inherited. So an organism can inherit a pattern of genes being switched on or off from their ancestors, depending on what's happened to the ancestors, how they've adapted to their environment, or how they've learned a particular new skill or form of behavior. So morphogenetic fields are one kind of what I call morphic fields. Morphic field is like a genus of which morphogenetic fields are a species. Morphogenetic fields are the morphic fields concerned with the development of form in animals and plants and microbes. Behavioral fields are the fields concerned with the organization of behavior and the activity of the nervous system, which underlie animal behavior. Mental fields are the fields that underlie mental activity. Social fields are the fields that underlie social behavior, like flocks of birds or schools of fish or termite colonies. All these kinds of field are all different kinds of morphic field. And morphic fields have the common property of being shaped by morphic resonance, having an inherent memory from the past. So now coming to the point about genes and how they're inadequate for explaining inheritance, what genes do, as I've already pointed out, is code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some code for switching on or switching off other genes, and some code for RNA, which is involved in ribosomes and in other structures in the cell, and of course messenger RNA, which is for making proteins. So genes are all about protein synthesis and the control of protein synthesis. Now, making the right proteins is very important for an organism, but it's not enough. It's like if you're building a house, you need the right building materials: cement, mortar, timber, tiles for the roof, and so forth. But having the right building materials doesn't give you a house. Just having those delivered to a building site doesn't create the house. And the normal view in biology is to focus almost all attention on genes and molecular biology, how you get the right molecules. And then it's simply assumed that by complex interactions, they'll self-assemble into a cell or into a tissue or an organism. But that's simply an assumption, and nobody knows how it works. And they just say, well, it happens by mechanisms not yet fully understood. Well, it's like saying the house will just build itself if you just shake up the building materials enough. That's not how it works. A house has an architectural plan, which is more like an idea than a thing. Normally it's written down on paper, but it could just be an idea in the mind of the builder, not a physical, observable thing at all. And yet, that's what shapes the structure of the house. And with the same building materials, you can build houses of different plans and different forms. So I think that's the role that the morphic field plays, shaping the form, the behavior. And in the 1980s, when I first proposed the idea of morphic resonance, and when I wrote about its role in inheritance, like in my book, The Presence of the Past, as you just quoted, there was tremendous opposition to this idea because everyone was convinced that genes would explain everything. The Human Genome Project was launched in 1987, and the idea was that by decoding the genome of humans, we'd understand human nature in molecular detail. We'd know everything we needed to know about hereditary human nature. In fact, when the Human Genome Project was accomplished in the year 2000, it turned out to be a tremendous disappointment. First of all, there were far fewer genes than anyone expected. They expected about 100,000. In fact, there are only about 20,000. And we have fewer genes than a sea urchin, and about less than half as many as a rice plant. So it wasn't at all what people expected. And then when people tried to predict human characteristics like proneness to breast cancer or liability to become schizophrenic or things like that on the basis of genomes, the predicted power was very low. The genome could only predict 5% or 10% of the inheritance of these and other characteristics, whereas it was known that 80 or 90% could be inherited, but the genes could only explain 5 to 10%. And the rest of what was inherited came to be called the missing heritability problem. It was a huge shock for molecular biologists because they thought genes would explain everything, and they don't. So I think that a lot of what is not explained by genes is, in fact, explained by morphic resonance. In the 1980s, people thought I was being outrageous when I said that genes were grossly overrated and couldn't possibly explain most aspects of inheritance. And that's one reason morphic resonance was such a controversial idea at the time. It's still controversial, of course. But the idea that there could be another form of inheritance over and above genes seemed to most people impossible. Whereas now, we desperately need an understanding of inheritance that goes beyond genes. Some people think that this can be explained by epigenetic inheritance. It's now known that characteristics acquired by plants or animals as they adapt to their environment can actually be inherited. This is the so-called inheritance of acquired characteristics. And in 20th century biology in the West, this was considered the ultimate heresy, Lamarckian inheritance, as proposed by Lamarck in around 1800. It was considered to be completely heretical because all heredity was supposed to be genetic. Interestingly, in the Soviet Union, under T.D. Lysenko, the inheritance of acquired characters was orthodox. And that made it even more controversial in the West and taboo because it became tied up with the Cold War. So there was a kind of Cold War in biology as well. However, around the year 2000, the evidence for the inheritance of acquired characters became overwhelming, and it was rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and it's now a major research field within biology. Most people assume that this inheritance of acquired characters can be explained by modifications to the expression of genes, inheriting genes being switched on or switched off through things like methylation of the DNA or of histone proteins associated with it. But actually, I think a lot of what is branded epigenetic inheritance is actually a form of morphic resonance. So I think morphic resonance leads to the inheritance of acquired characters, just as it's now known to happen. And there may well be inherited epigenetic molecular changes, but I think a lot of this inheritance is in fact due to morphic resonance.
Do we know the actual mechanism? Because you say resonance, so it means it must resonate, right? But how does it work? Do we really know, or it's a hunch still?
No one knows how it works. It's a postulate, a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that this happens. Now, exactly how it happens, nobody knows. There have been various people who've attempted to explain it. For example, David Bohm, the well-known quantum physicist, thought that morphic resonance could work through what he called the implicate order, which is a hidden order that underlies quantum processes and affects the probabilities of events happening at the quantum level. Bernard Carr, who is a British theoretical physicist, thinks that morphic resonance may work through some of the extra dimensions that are present in superstring or M theory. In modern theoretical physics, they have 10 or 11 dimensions, one of time and the others of space. And he thinks these additional spatial dimensions could allow for these kinds of connections based on similarity that I'm talking about. But hardly anyone understands superstring theory. So if somebody says, well, what's the mechanism? And I say, well, here's superstring theory, pages and pages of impenetrable equations. Most people aren't actually going to be any the wiser as a result of this. So I myself don't understand pages and pages of equations. So I don't bother too much about these theoretical models, because for me, the important thing is the empirical question: does it really happen? And doing experimental tests to see if morphic resonance really does happen seems to me the priority. If it can be established beyond reasonable doubt that it's really going on, then I think a lot of theoretical physicists and others would try and come up with models for it. And we might not end up with a single model. I mean, after all, when Faraday postulated the electric and the magnetic fields in the 1840s, he had no idea how they worked. And then Maxwell came along 20 years later with his equations of electromagnetism, Maxwell's equations, which treated light as a vibration in the ether, as an electromagnetic vibration in the ether, subtle matter. Then Einstein came along in 1905 in the special theory of relativity and said there's no such thing as the ether. It's just fields. And then quantum electrodynamics came along and said, oh, well, there's this quantum vacuum field and electromagnetic phenomena depend on virtual photons that appear and disappear from an invisible field. So theories of something as straightforward as light have changed a lot over the last 150 years. And so I don't think that even if there was a physical theory of how morphic resonance works, it probably wouldn't be the last word, and new theories might come along. So that's why, I'm an empirical scientist by nature. I mean, I like doing experiments, which is why I think that the primary question at the moment is what sort of phenomena does morphic resonance happen in, and in what ways can it actually be detected?
So what are the key examples, you mentioned already some, of the morphic fields, the most striking and most obvious maybe, in your view?
You mean of morphic resonance?
Morphic resonance and
yes.
Types of morphic fields, you mentioned some of them already.
Well, the thing is that I think that morphogenetic fields which shape developing organisms probably have an electrical component to them. Michael Levin at Tufts University has shown that in developing tadpoles, for example, there are electric fields over the whole organism. And I think that's the morphogenetic field expresses itself through these electric fields. But in terms of morphic resonance, the memory principle, I think the most striking examples are rats learning a new trick. When rats were trained to escape from a water maze in the long series of experiments at Harvard, they got better and better at it. And then, because this looked like an inheritance for acquired characters, which was very controversial, people in Edinburgh University and Melbourne, Australia University did the same experiments. Their rats learned much quicker than the Harvard rats. They took up where the Harvard ones had left off. And the researchers in Australia showed that this improvement continued. The more rats that learned the trick, the easier it got for others to learn it. And this was not just rats descended from parents who'd learned the trick, but other rats of the same breed also got better. Now that, I think, is a very good example of morphic resonance. Also, in chemistry, if you make new chemical compounds for the first time, they're very hard to crystallize. And I think that's because there isn't a morphogenetic field for that crystal. It hasn't happened yet. Chemists often have to wait months or years before the first crystal forms. But after it's formed, it gets easier and easier all around the world to crystallize the same compound, the more often it's made. Chemists recognize this, but they just assume it must be because of fragments of previous crystals being wafted around the world in the atmosphere as invisible dust particles. But what I'm saying is the same would happen even when you filter out invisible dust particles. And to take a contemporary example, which is the subject of research at the moment in Britain, there's a student doing a project on this right now as we speak. If you take the word puzzle Wordle, it's a 5-letter word puzzle published every day by the New York Times. The word puzzle is solved in a given day by millions of people. I would predict that the word puzzle would be harder to do in the morning when it's just been published than in the evening when millions of people around the world have already done it. And indeed, the student who's called Georgia Black has actually found that people do, in fact, find it easier to get Wordle right the first time or the second time as the day goes on. So that looks as if morphic resonance could be working there. Of course, in the real life experiments, life's sort of messy because people could be cheating and one would need to do more rigorous experiments. But the fact that this seems to be happening with Wordle is particularly interesting, because one of the things I predicted years ago is that it should be easier to do the Times crossword puzzle the day after it's published than the day it is published, because so many people would have done it. It should make it easier for others to do. And quite a number of people who do serious crosswords have actually found that. And there was even an experiment with crossword puzzles here in England showing that, yes, they did seem to get easier to do after many people had done them. So morphic resonance can be tested in many different ways, in the chemical realm, in the biological realm, through inheritance, and also in the realm of human learning through things like word puzzles.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that actually we cannot study morphic fields directly, or morphogenetic fields, or morphic resonance. We can only study the effects of those, right?
Yes.
There isn't a way to measure it because, for example, NASA just measured for the first time the global electric field of the Earth. And that's a theory which is 60 years old. But we only managed to measure it for the first time just now, recently, like last month or something. Well, do you think morphic fields will ever be measured as such?
Well, I think you can measure them. The thing is, fields are measured through fields themselves. If you want to measure an electric field, you don't use a pendulum, like you'd use to measure a gravitational field, or you use an electric meter. If you want a magnetic field, you use a magnetic meter. If you're measuring a gravitational field, you use a torsion thing or some pendulum system where you're looking at the attraction between masses. You don't do it electrically. You can't measure a gravitational field with an electric meter. And so you can't measure a morphogenetic field with a gravitational detector or an electric field, except insofar as the morphogenetic field affects the electric field. But you're not measuring it directly. We always measure fields through their effects. We don't measure the field directly. We measure the electrical field through its effect on some electrically charged particle, or we measure a magnetic field through its effect on a magnet. For example, the Earth's magnetic field we measure through a little magnet, which is the compass needle. We're not measuring the Earth's magnetic field through say, a thermometer. You have to measure it through the right kind of thing. So if you want to study the morphogenetic field of involved in the development of a plant, then you could measure the strength of the field by having large numbers of plants modified in a particular way, adapting to a particular environment, and then seeing how strong the effect is. Or take the rat example. If you have rats that are getting better at learning a maze, the strength of the field depends on how many have already learned it. So if there's 1,000 rats have learned it, the effect should be stronger than if only 10 rats had learned it. And so you'd see rats learning it more quickly after 1,000 than after 10 had learned it before. And that would give you a measurement of the strength of the field. You could plot it on the graph, the number of rats that had learned it versus the speed at which new rats learn it. So you can measure them, but you have to measure them through morphic effects rather than through electric meters or thermometers.
Do you know that in Japan, they use a Physarum algorithm? And that's something which was developed by biologist Professor Toshiyuki Nakagaki. So I'm not really, my Japanese is not really up these days. And what he's done, he used mazes, slime mold, and sugar. And so he let the mold fill in the maze, going from one end to another, seeking sugar on the other side. And the first thing, what happens is the mold filling up completely the entire maze, and then it starts retracting, and it retracts and it removes itself from every dead end and suboptimal route. So he ended up several times with absolutely optimal, path from one end to another in the maze. And so they developed a Physarum algorithm, they call it, and they use it to optimize the national railway network because it's cheaper, it's more effective, and more ingenious. I don't know if you've heard of this example. So
Yes.
is there a way to explain this from the point of view of Morphic or morphogenetics of resonance?
Well, I mean, in that kind of experiment, you see, one of the things that slime molds and also fungi can do, and this is something my son Merlin writes about in his book on fungi and tangled life, they can branch out in many different directions all at once. I mean, an animal, if it's in a maze, say a fruit fly, it reaches a junction, it can only go one way, left or right. But if it's a mold or a slime mold, it can go both ways all at once, and then find the answer and then retract or dissolve the other branches. Now, it's basically, I suppose, to start with trial or error, just exploring all possibilities, then you find something that works and then concentrate on that. What I'd like to know in relation to the Fusarium experiments is when they did exactly the same experiment again and again, did they learn quicker on subsequent trials? Now, you see, that morphic resonance might then be involved if they now learn quicker and could adapt faster. Unfortunately, most scientists, when they do their experiments, they base it on the hidden assumption within science that nature is governed by eternal laws. This was built into science as an assumption in the 17th century. And it's basically a version of the Platonic philosophy, that there's an ultimate reality out there that's mathematical. It never changes, it's beyond space and time, and it influences everything in the universe, at all places, at all times. And therefore, when you do an experiment, if you do it again another time, it should be exactly the same, the results, because the laws of nature don't change. Every scientific experiment should, in principle, be repeatable indefinitely and not depend on what's happened in the past. And because most scientists just take that for granted, they're not even aware that it's an assumption. It's just so much the common sense of science. It's part of the eternal law paradigm, which is built into the foundations of contemporary science, that when they do an experiment over and over again, instead of looking carefully to see if it happens quicker as time goes on, they just assume that it's the same. And if it does get quicker, they assume it's just them getting better at doing the experiment through experience. And people often find they do get easier to do, and the experiments, things do happen faster. But when they're doing research, they're not looking for morphic resonance effects. And so they always explain away these findings by saying, oh, well, it must just have been us. One example of this is in chemistry. I predict that because of morphic resonance, when you make a new crystal, as time goes on, the crystal will become more and more stable as a result of morphic resonance from previous crystals of the same kind. And because it's more stable, it will be harder to break it up. And how you break up crystals is by heating them. And the point at which they break up is called the melting point. So I predict that new compounds should show gradually increasing melting points as time goes on. Now, most chemists assume that melting points are physical constants. In fact, they're printed in books called handbooks of physical constants. But when you look at libraries, science libraries, or online resources at these physical constant reference works, they're continually updated. You know, the CRC Handbook of Physical Constants is like the 45th edition. And the reason they're updated is because the constants actually change. And new ones come, new chemicals come along. Actually, the melting points do go up. The vast majority of chemicals, newly formed chemicals, the melting points do rise. I've found this by looking into the history of melting points. And several chemists have helped me with this research. So then when you say to chemists, oh, look, these melting points are actually changing, they're going up, they say, oh, that's just because we're getting better at making the chemicals. You know, the impurity is lower, the melting point, and so we must be getting purer and purer samples that have higher melting points. You say, well, how do you know they're purer? They say, well, they must be purer, they've got higher melting points. So, you see, they don't think in terms of trying to look at the same phenomenon under exactly the same conditions repeatedly, which is why I think morphic resonance is going on in laboratories all the time, but frustratingly, people simply don't notice it. So one of the things I try and do is encourage people working in laboratories where they're studying new chemicals or new materials or new quantum systems, which are actually material science and solid-state physics is one of the most exciting areas of current physics. People are continually developing new superconducting systems or with new physical macroscopic quantum properties. And I think if they look if they do exactly the same experiment repeatedly, they should see the process speeding up or happening more easily. I think the data are already there in lots of laboratories, but people simply don't look at it through this lens.
Are there laws of nature? You mentioned laws of nature, or maybe, well, are there any constants at all? Because, or is it just tendencies and habits of nature? Because when I was at school, it was all very clear, solid, you measure, you get the result, it's all the same, and there are hard laws of nature. You just have to learn them.
Yes, that's it. Well, that's the standard assumption, you see, since the 17th century. There are laws of nature. And actually, when you think about it, the whole concept of laws of nature is very, very questionable. To start with, it's incredibly anthropocentric. Here in Britain, one of the founders of modern science was Sir Francis Bacon. And Sir Francis Bacon was one of the first people in the early 17th century to speak about the laws of nature and the role of science in finding them out. Well, Francis Bacon's day job was Lord Chancellor of England. He was a lawyer. And so naturally, the metaphor of law came to him. The idea, just as the King of England could make up new laws and the Lord Chancellor could help enforce them and interpret them, so the ruler of the universe, God, made up laws of nature. And because God was all-powerful and was the cosmic police force, nothing could disobey the laws of nature. They were just rigidly had to follow the laws of nature, totally obedient to the laws of nature, all matter, the whole universe. That was the metaphor. So it's obviously highly anthropomorphic. But if you think through the metaphor, the fact is the laws of England change and the laws of everywhere else change. And in fact, in England, the laws depend on common law. Some of them depend on what we call common law, depending not on what laws being passed by kings or parliament, but on precedents. If a judge finds a particular judgment in a particular case, then that judgment is cited in subsequent cases because it sets a precedent. And a lot of our law is based on common law. It's based on custom or tradition. It's different from the continental system of Napoleonic law, where you have a kind of codified code Napoleon, where all the laws are codified and so on. In England, they've evolved. And the laws of even the Code Napoleon, was started under Napoleon. It's not as if it was the law of the French law forever. So even that has, of course, a history, and French laws have been modified ever since that code was put forward. So I think that if we actually think through the metaphor of laws, they evolve, they change with time and circumstance. So the idea they're eternal and fixed is a violation of the very concept of law as we actually know it. But then the other thing is, you see, it's hugely anthropocentric because only humans have laws. And in fact, tribal societies have customs. They don't have codified laws. Only civilized societies have laws. So it's a highly anthropocentric metaphor. And I think the metaphor of habit is much more natural. We have habits, animals have habits, even crystals have habits. Crystallographers speak about crystal habits. Habits are very, very widespread in nature. Laws are not. So I think evolving habits make much more sense than fixed laws. And then, of course, the idea of constants, which you mentioned, that again it's assumed that the laws and constants of nature were all laid down at the moment of the Big Bang, that somehow at the very moment of the Big Bang, about 13 billion years ago, suddenly, out of nowhere, the entire universe came into existence. All the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it suddenly appeared. And they've never changed since. That's the standard scientific assumption. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And this is the one free miracle. All the matter and energy in the universe suddenly appears from nowhere, and all the laws that govern it. And the constants, the speed of light, the charge on the electron, the fine structure constant, the gravitational constant, big G, all these constants are supposed to be fixed. Well, how do we know? If you actually measure these constants, they change all the time, which is why you have ever new editions of handbooks of physical constants. Big G varies quite a lot, the Newton's gravitational constant, by as much as 1% in recent decades. These things are supposed to be defined to many places of decimals. And And so when they vary, the normal assumption of physicists is to say, oh, well, the previous ones must have been measuring errors, and the new one is the latest best value and stuff. And then 5 or 10 years later, there's a new best value comes along. So all of this, you see, is just pure assumption that the laws and the constants are fixed. And then it leads to a tissue of speculation which obsesses cosmologists and people who follow popular science. If all the laws and constants were fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, why were they fixed in exactly the right way for us to exist, for life to appear? The laws could have been different, the constants could have been different. And if they were, the universe would never have given rise to carbon atoms, to life on Earth, etc., etc. This is the anthropic principle, the cosmological anthropic principle. So people say, well, then if they're exactly right for us, and all these things are completely fine-tuned, exactly right, then either there must be a kind of engineering God who's outside the universe, who fine-tunes the knobs, the constants and everything before he presses the start button for the Big Bang, which is a kind of neo-deism, a kind of 18th century machine-making God outside the universe, which then proceeds automatically once it's been started. Or they say, well, there must be billions, trillions of actual universes, and we just exist in the one that's right for us. It's the only one we can actually know, but all the others actually exist. And then you say to them, well, why on earth do you want to postulate billions of unobserved universes for which there's not a shred of evidence, no evidence whatsoever for all these extra universes? And yet the people who believe this are eminent scientists. For example, Lord Rees, who was president of the Royal Society, master of Trinity College, Cambridge, astronomer royal, is one of the proponents of this evidence-free hypothesis. It's amazing to me that cosmologists can get away with this. I mean, if you work in, say, as I do, in things like telepathy, and you have really good evidence for telepathy, there's sort of howls of protest. They say, oh, no evidence would be enough to convince us that something like that could exist. Yet, billions of extra universes can get away with it scot-free. So anyway, they assume that there are all these extra universes in order to try and explain why the laws and constants were fixed at the Big Bang in the way they are. And the reason they want lots of universes, as I asked Lord Rees himself about this, I said, well, why do you want all these all these universes? And he said, well, that way we can get rid of God. And I said, well, you mean by postulating trillions of universes, you think this is a simpler hypothesis than God? He said, but I said, it seems to me like the ultimate violation of Occam's razor, that you shouldn't postulate unnecessary entities. He said, well, I agree that's a bit of a problem. We're working on it. So the point is that, as theologians have pointed out, if an infinite God could be the God of an infinite number of universes, so they haven't even got rid of God. They just proliferated universes. And all this follows from the unquestioned assumption that laws and constants must be fixed. Whereas in an evolutionary universe, to me, it makes much more sense to think of them as evolving. Through natural selection, unsuccessful habits don't get repeated. Successful ones get repeated. The more often they're repeated, the more habitual they become. So most of the phenomena in physics that we look at in physics labs, the behavior of hydrogen atoms, for example, they've been doing much the same thing for 14 billion years. So these habits are extremely fixed. They behave as if they're governed by eternal laws. But when you look at new chemical compounds or new physical systems like Bose-Einstein condensates that probably never existed in nature before they were created in low-temperature physics labs, then you're looking at things that are really new, where you may well be able to see morphic resonance effects. So anyway, I think the idea of fixed laws and fixed constants leads into absurd theoretical speculations, which are completely unnecessary. The whole question of is there a God who fine-tunes nature, or are there billions of universes as an alternative to this engineering God? This entire ridiculous debate just fades away, it melts away like the morning mist if you have the idea of the evolution of habits in nature, not laws.
What is the role of the brain in the context of morphic field theory? Is it the tuning mechanism for morphic systems, and where memories are stored and where collective memories are stored in your view?
Yeah, the brain's a tuning system, I think, and it helps to coordinate our perceptions through our senses and our movements. Obviously, you need a brain in order to coordinate your bodily movements, including movements of your mouth and speech organs in order to speak. So brains are intimately connected with perception and with movement. And I don't think all our thoughts, ideas, and dreams, etc., are stored inside our heads. I don't think that our consciousness is confined to the inside of the head either. I think our minds stretch out like fields far beyond our brains. The field of a magnet stretches out far beyond a magnet. The gravitational field of the Earth stretches out far beyond the Earth, invisibly. The field of your mobile telephone stretches out far beyond the mobile telephone, invisibly. I mean, this room I'm in, the room you're in, are full of mobile telephone transmissions, radio and TV transmissions. They're invisible. We can't see them, but they're all there. We can find them if we have a device that resonates with them, that picks them up by resonance. So I think that our brains are like that, resonant devices that pick up memories by resonance. And I think the fields of our minds are extended all around us all the time. For example, I'm seeing an image of you, Natalia, on the screen at the moment, about 2 feet in front of me. And I think my image of you is located on the screen where it seems to be, whereas the official view is that it's inside my head. The official view is the light comes from the screen, goes into my eyes, inverted images, changes in cone cells, impulses up the optic nerve, changes in the cerebral cortex, particularly the visual cortex. And then, in a way no one understands, a 3-dimensional full-color image of the world around me appears inside my brain, which I imagine, I have the illusion that it's actually out there, but it's actually inside my head. Now, I think the images I'm seeing are out there. I think I project them out. I think changes happen in the brain, and I'm projecting out everything I'm seeing. It's out there. It's in my mind, but it's not inside my brain. So I think just the simplest act of vision, just looking at anything, tells us the mind is extended. The official view would cram all of this into our brain and tell us it's all really inside the head. And so I think that the fields of our minds are morphic fields. I think when we see things, they're perceptual fields. We're not seeing what's exactly there. What we're seeing is our interpretation of it, which is projected onto whatever we're looking at. Some neuroscientists call perception a controlled hallucination. I think it's quite a good phrase. I think it's controlled because it has to fit with the input of our senses. If it doesn't, then it's an uncontrolled hallucination, and we're seeing things that aren't really there. We're hallucinating or we're seeing illusions. But normally, it's controlled by being brought into close correspondence with what we're actually seeing or experiencing through the senses. But it's not inside the brain. One of the things I do is try to test this. You see, the idea is, are all our thoughts and inside our brains is taken for granted by most psychologists and most materialist philosophers and most people who've been indoctrinated with the materialist worldview. But it doesn't correspond to our experience, and no one's ever seen these 3-dimensional virtual reality displays inside heads. So some philosophers have started questioning it, and there are some of them who are called radical externalists, some of them called inactivists, who say that, yes, the controlled hallucinations aren't all inside our brain. They do extend out beyond our brain into the world around us. But the trouble with just saying that is it's kind of armchair philosophy. It doesn't make any difference, really, because they don't think these extensions of our minds actually do anything. Whereas I think they do something. I feel that if I look at something, my mind is reaching out to touch it, and it might affect it just by looking at it. Now, if I look at another person from behind, and they don't know I'm there, if my mind touches them, and if I can affect them, they might feel me looking at them and turn round. And actually, this is a very, very well-known phenomenon, the sense of being stared at, or the technical scientific name is scopaesthesia. Scop, looks as in microscope, aesthesia, feeling as in anesthesia, synesthesia. So I think that people and animals can be affected by being looked at, and they respond by turning around. 95% of people have had this experience, looking at others who've turned around or turning around to find someone staring at them. Now, this is a completely taboo topic within the academic world. It ought not to happen if the mind's all in the brain. Therefore, for many scientists, it doesn't happen. It can't happen, therefore it doesn't happen. And therefore, all the evidence for it from millions of people all through the world, all through human history, the results of tens of thousands of controlled experiments which have already been done, all of this is of no relevance at all because it's impossible, it doesn't exist. And no one should be allowed to discuss it in a university or in a scientific journal because it's a taboo topic. This is the current situation. But actually, the evidence for it is quite strong. And so I think that this is an area where we can actually explore a philosophical idea, a metaphysical idea about the nature of mind, the extended mind, the nature of vision, empirically. So I think, for me, unless philosophical ideas can be tested experimentally, they're of less interest than if there's just philosophical ideas. I think testing things experimentally is very important. And now, coming to your question about memory in the brain, as I already said, I don't think memories are stored inside the brain. You see, people think it's all inside the head. The memories are all there, the mind's all there, everything's inside the head. This very cerebrocentric view of consciousness, which has been standard in materialism. The whole universe is unconscious. There's no memory anywhere in the universe. The only consciousness in the entire universe is inside human brains and maybe the brains of other animals. That's the standard view. And so memory is purely a psychological phenomenon, therefore must be inside the brain. Well, people have tried to find physical memory traces inside brains for more than 100 years with no success. They've just simply been elusive over and over again. And I think that's because they're not there. I think the brain's a tuning system, not a memory storage system. I think it's more like a TV set than a video recorder. I think it's tuning in to the memories across time. A TV set tunes in by resonance across space, electromagnetic resonance across space. I think memory depends on the brain tuning in through morphic resonance across time. So it's a tuning system. The memories aren't in the brain, and our perceptions, everything we see, isn't in the brain either. So the brain is certainly important, essential for perception and for action and so on. But I think it's grossly overrated, and I think all the things that are supposed to happen inside it are not really inside it at all. The memories aren't really inside it, and the perceptions aren't really inside it. And indeed, this goes for our whole body. When I feel a pain in my toe, the official view is the pain isn't actually in my toe, it's in my brain, and it's then referred to the toe. I think it's actually in the toe. I think our minds are extended throughout our bodies and far beyond them.
But where is the mind located? And is there such thing like mind at large? And what's the relationship between mind at large and our perception or experience of our own little minds, in your view?
Well, I think our body is normally the center of our consciousness. I mean, our consciousness is centered in our bodies normally when we're awake. When we're asleep, then it's a different matter. In our dreams, we have dream worlds which are lit up by light. We have a kind of inner light which is present in our dreams and in visions and in psychedelic experiences. You can have vivid psychedelic experiences with your eyes shut, yet things are lit up and they're in full color. You're in a different space. In my dreams, I can move around, I can talk to people, I can go to places. I have a dream body that's not the same as my physical body that's lying asleep in bed. So that space, the normal assumption is all that space is inside the brain too. But it doesn't feel like it. There's no evidence it is. I mean, the brain certainly has certain changes in rhythm when you're dreaming, but that doesn't prove that everything you're dreaming is nothing but those changes in rhythm in the brain. Those may be a state you go into when you're dreaming. I mean, you could leave a car engine on and you could go for a walk in the countryside, and the car would be stationary, the engine would just be running, and someone who measured the car engine would say, well, this is what the engine's like when people feel they're having an experience outside the car by wandering around. And it would correlate with going for a walk in the countryside, but it wouldn't correlate with what you're seeing or experiencing. It would simply correlate with the fact that you're not in the car and the car's stationary. I mean, a lot of people think the brain consciousness is nothing but the brain because changing the brain changes consciousness. But the philosopher Henri Bergson had a very simple answer to that, which is, if you have a coat hanging on a nail or a coat hook, take away the coat hook and the coat collapses to the floor, but the coat hook doesn't explain the shape of the coat or the color of the coat or anything like that, although the coat being there intimately depends on the coat hook. So dreams may depend on the brain, but the content of the dreams may not be related in any very close way to what's happening in the brain. So I think that our minds extend beyond our brains in ordinary perception, but also in our dreams. And so where is your mind when you're dreaming? I think it's in a dream world, in a dream space, which is a virtual realm of consciousness that's not the same as our waking state of consciousness. And I think psychedelic experiences are also in something a bit like the dream world, but it's much more vivid and immediate. The same kind of imaginal world that we can, and maybe when we die, we enter a world like that. And we can't get out of it because we can't wake up anymore. So I think our minds are normally centered in our bodies in waking life. In dream life, they're centered in our dream bodies because we have a point of view in dreams. We're not everywhere all the time. We have a presence in a particular place in a dream body. I think there's a collective mind or memory that works through all people. We all participate in a collective unconscious, as Jung put, or collective memory. And that's expressed through individual humans. I think the mind of if we take a panpsychist view and say, well, the earth has a mind, then the mind of the earth would be in and around the earth. And if we take the view the sun has a mind, which I think it has, and I think the sun is conscious, then the mind of the sun is within and around the sun, and the mind of other stars is within and around those stars. The mind of the galaxy is within and around the galaxy. The mind of the entire cosmos is within and around the entire cosmos. So I think there is a cosmic mind underlying the whole cosmos. It's not a new idea, of course. The anima mundi, the soul of the earth, in Plato and in Neoplatonism, It's a very important concept. So if you want the idea of mind at large, then I suppose the cosmic mind would be the ultimate mind. And then if we take the idea of the divine mind, then one would say that unless one's a pantheist, where the cosmic mind is the mind of God, then the mind of God would be beyond the cosmic mind, transcendent to the cosmic mind, which would include not just our cosmos, but all possible cosmos, all possible worlds. So I think that if we're going to have the idea of mind at large, then it's going to be very large if we think this idea through.
Can morphic fields be understood as collective memories of nature's mind, or the mind at large? And why do you think nature is organized in fields? What's the reason for it?
Well, nature's made up of organizations at different levels of size and complexity. If you have an atom, it's made up of a nucleus and the electrons around it. And the nucleus is made up of nuclear particles. And then a molecule is made up of atoms bound together. So at each level, you have, say, the atom like that, and then you have a molecular field around the molecule. Then if it's a crystal, you have a crystal field around all the molecules that make up the crystal and give it its order. And in our bodies, you have fields around each molecule in the body, around molecular complexes like ribosomes, organelles like mitochondria and nuclei, then fields of the whole cell, then fields of tissues, fields of organs, fields of organisms, fields of societies of organisms like termite mounds, fields of whole ecosystems, fields of the planet Earth, of the solar system, of the galaxy. You have a whole series, a nested hierarchy or holarchy of fields, one within the other. Each level, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And at each level, I think there's a morphic field with its own memory organizing that whole. So I think there are many levels of fields, and they're in a hierarchy, not in some kind of arbitrary, power-hungry structure where one field is dictating it over other ones, but simply by virtue of inclusion. The Earth is undoubtedly included within the solar system, which is a higher level field. The solar system is undoubtedly included within the galaxy, which is a higher level field. And it's higher level because it's more inclusive and larger and more inclusive. So I think that's why fields, you need different levels of morphic fields.
You have that, you say that the mind is not really located in our brains and it's all around, right? So you're saying essentially that minds are porous. I have a friend of mine, and she doesn't like football, but she loves to go to games. So I asked her, why are you going to football games? She said, oh, I want to feel all these emotions and soak it up. I feel so energized afterwards. So my question is, our thoughts and emotions, do you think they're all our own?
Well, no, I think, as you say, we share in collective moods. We're connected. We resonate with each other. We're part of social groups. We're social animals. And all social animals have a way of resonating with other members of the social group. I mean, flocks of birds, when you see starlings flying together, you can have hundreds of thousands of starlings flying together, and they change direction without bumping into each other. Not only do they know where their neighbors are, but they know where they're going to go. There's a kind of group mind phenomenon, which is modeled mathematically. It can be modeled as a field. That's how it's modeled. So I think that we're termites, and the whole behavior of a flock of animals, like a flock of sheep. They can all be frightened at the same time and panic together and show collective responses. And as humans, we do too. I think that we have a whole range of social fields of which we're part, probably the most basic being the family. And family fields have patterns or structures that hold the members of the family together in their relationship with each other. And I think our morphic fields in our families inherit patterns from previous generations of the family. And this is one of the things that comes to light in systemic family constellation work. My wife, Jo Purcell, is a practitioner of systemic family constellations. So I've often seen this at work. And it really is as if there's a memory coming through the family field that affects people in the family. So individual psychotherapy often can't help somebody who's acting out a pattern that's part of the family field. Only becoming aware of the family field and the inherited pattern within it can the person be released from what would otherwise be compulsive or destructive behavior. So I think we're always influenced by these. And then, of course, a football team is a social field, working together, coordinated with each other. And then there's supporters, which share in the mood, the changing mood as the game goes on, also all sighing or all excited when there's a goal and stuff. The sharing in these collective emotions is very much part of being a wider social field. All social animals, by definition, have social structures and organizations, and which I think are a kind of morphic field. And we have lots. So we have our family fields, we have the fields of schools, of businesses, of particular groups of friends, teams like football and cricket teams, and the fields of jazz bands, the fields of orchestras, fields of choirs. And then there are all the fields of religion and religious rituals, which again are fields of activity. And through taking part in them, we connect by morphic resonance with other people and with those who've taken part in similar rituals before. All of these, I think, are examples of our being part of something larger than ourselves.
What is intuition from the perspective of morphic resonance?
Well, there are different kinds of intuition, so you have to distinguish between them. And there's one kind of intuition which is presentiment, feeling the future. I don't think that's necessarily a part of morphic resonance at all, because morphic resonance comes from the past, and there seems to be a way in which we can be open to the future. We can dream about events that haven't yet happened, as in precognitive dreams. Animals can feel forebodings or premonitions of events that haven't yet happened. For example, earthquakes and tsunamis. I've done research on the way in which animals can respond sometimes several days in advance before an earthquake. They pick up something's going to happen. No one knows how they do it, but they can do it, and often do it before earthquakes and tsunamis. Lots of different species. So I think I don't think morphic resonance explains everything. It doesn't explain creativity and various aspects of consciousness. It explains habits. It mainly explains unconscious habits. And when a crystal or a plant cell are developing, I'm not saying they're conscious because of morphic resonance. They may be, but most of our own behavior is unconscious. And I think most of nature, the habits are unconscious. So I think that the morphic resonance and can help explain some forms of intuition, particularly telepathy. Telepathy occurs between members of social groups. Almost all cases of human and animal telepathy are between closely bonded people or animals. I wrote a whole book on animal telepathy called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, because many dogs and cats and other animals pick up the intention of their owner when they're on the way home. They go and wait at a door or window, often quite a long time in advance, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour in advance, long before they could have heard or smelled the person coming. I've done lots of experiments on it too. Have people come at non-routine times from at least 8 kilometers away in unfamiliar vehicles. We film the dog all the time, and sure enough, the dog starts waiting when they form the intention to come home. And some dogs only do it a few minutes before, and when it's very shortly before, it could be hearing footsteps or car wheels on the gravel or something. But in many cases, it's long before that could possibly explain it. And so I think there's a kind of resonance in telepathy, where if I'm bonded with someone, we're connected through the morphic field of our group. We've interacted many times in the past. There's a kind of memory of our interactions. And if I focus my attention on that person or animal, they may feel it by a kind of resonance. So I think dogs can feel when their owners are coming home. Many people feel when someone wants to call them. The commonest kind of telepathy in the modern world is telephone telepathy, which happens in connection with telephone calls, emails, or text messages, where most people have had the experience of thinking of someone who then calls them or sends them a message, and then they say, "It's funny, I was just thinking about you." Or lots of people just know who it is when they hear the phone ring before they look at the caller ID or answer the telephone. So these forms of telepathy are a kind of intuition. I think those are explicable through morphic resonance because they're about connection within the social group and a resonant connection between different members of the social group, even when they're far away from each other.
You advocate changing the current scientific paradigm. What do you think needs to change and why?
Well, what needs to change is moving towards a view of nature as alive, organic, and interconnected, as opposed to a view of nature as machine-like, inanimate, unconscious, and unconnected, except through gravity, electromagnetism, etc. So I wrote a book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States, where I take the 10 dogmas of contemporary science and show that we really need to move on beyond them. In all 10 cases, the dogmas have been superseded by science itself. That's it, yes. And so what I'm arguing, you see, is that the mechanistic materialism, the current paradigm, is inadequate. What we need is a view of nature as alive. Nature is more like an organism than a machine. If we want a guiding metaphor for the universe, for the sun, for the stars, for organisms, then the organism is a better metaphor than the machine. The idea that the laws evolve, in fact, they're more like habits, is part of that new paradigm, which I've already talked about. The idea that consciousness is pervasive throughout the universe, and that the universe, in the end, comes forth from consciousness, is, I think, a very important part of the new paradigm. Now, there's differences of opinion about how that ultimate consciousness is related to the universe. Analytical idealism, as in Bernardo Kastrup, is one way of thinking of it. There are other ways too. I myself take a different view, but I agree with Kastrup that consciousness is primary. And so then it's a question of how do we explain the material structures and the behavior of nature with an origin in consciousness, an ultimate origin or source in consciousness. That takes us into realms of metaphysics and theology, which we don't have time to discuss now. That would be a topic for a separate discussion.
Do we need to bring, or should we strive to bring science closer to spirituality? Would we not lose science if we do that?
I wrote 2 books on science and spirituality, one called Science and Spiritual Practices and another one called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And each book is about 7 different spiritual practices, including prayer, meditation, pilgrimage, fasting, rituals, singing and chanting, connecting with nature, celebration and holy days. Each book deals with a variety of spiritual practices which have been investigated scientifically. And when scientists actually investigate the effects of, say, meditation on people, they have measurable effects. There's changes in blood pressure, physiology, brain waves. There's increased well-being, less proneness to depression. There's all sorts of measurable effects from spiritual practices. So I think science can help to illuminate spiritual practices and already shows that they're beneficial. In general, people who have spiritual or religious practices are happier, healthier, and live longer than those that don't. So I think the evidence is already pretty clear that I think militant atheism should come with a health warning insofar as it alienates people from traditional spiritual practices and gives them very little in return except an illusory sense of intellectual superiority. So I think that the practice of science needs to be liberated from these constrictive dogmas of mechanistic materialism. And as I show in my book, The Science Delusion, if we go beyond those dogmas, science gets much more interesting. All sorts of new research becomes possible. New questions can be asked. We can find out more about nature and more about consciousness by doing science in a new, more open way. But what remains part of science, so crucial to it, is the empirical approach, the putting forward of hypotheses, the critical discussion and the testing of hypotheses by experiment. That, the scientific method, I'm all in favor of. But I think what we need is a science that uses the scientific method, but which is no longer constricted in the way it is at present by the dogmas of mechanistic materialism. Then all sorts of new questions and new experiments would become possible.
Rupert, one last question for students and young scientists. What advice would you give them striving, for future science to change the paradigm? What would you say to them?
It's difficult at the moment to change it if you're a student. I'm not a student, and I find it pretty difficult to try and change it. It's controversial. If you do anything really radical, you'll lose your job. You won't get grants from official granting agencies. Leading journals will turn down your papers because they say they're not scientific enough or they don't fit the existing models and so forth. And there's virtually no one teaching in universities at the moment a more holistic approach to science. So I think the only thing at the moment is to go ahead with studying regular science. So you need to know how to do experiments. You need to know the concepts, the terminology. You need to know how to publish papers in scientific journals. And you won't be able to make much difference to science without knowing about it and without knowing its conventions. But then I think there are certain areas where things are opening up. For example, in the realm of research on psychedelics, there's been a real opening in terms of what's possible within institutional science. And in consciousness studies in general, it is now possible to study things that would have been impossible to study in the 20th century. Things like lucid dreaming, near-death experiences, end-of-life experiences, visions, mystical experiences, and so forth. So I think there are certain areas that are already opening up. I think in other areas they haven't opened up yet, but they will, and they'll only be able to open up if there are people willing to do research in these areas and willing to fund it. And I don't think official government-sponsored agencies are going to fund anything very radical anytime soon, because they're dominated by committees made up of establishment scientists who will preserve the existing paradigm. That's what they've been trained to do. That's what their whole career is based on. But there is the possibility of unconventional science funding. There are now more billionaires than there have ever been before, and some of them are interested in science. So hopefully there will be foundations that will fund research in these areas. There are already one or two. The BIAL Foundation in Portugal, BIAL, funds a lot of research in parapsychology and in psychophysiology. So there are already a few fairly small foundations funding this work. I think that number will increase, and I think we all need to encourage people who have sufficient money to use that money more creatively than it's being used at present. So I hope that the scientific paradigm will change, but anyone who goes to university or does a PhD expecting it to change in the next year or two is going to be disappointed. The whole educational system is still mechanistically materialist throughout. We're still educating children in schools and universities, in the mechanistic materialist worldview. So change will come, but most of the ways in which you can learn about these broader ideas, unfortunately, are not inside universities and official courses, but fortunately, readily available through YouTube and other online sources, like the Essentia Foundation itself. These are educational institutions which are not in the traditional mold, and in most of them you won't get a bit of paper saying you're qualified in a way that will get you a better job. But there's certainly plenty of ways now to broaden your mind and to learn about things that you wouldn't learn about in a university yet. But hopefully soon you will be able to, but not very soon, probably.
Rupert, thank you very much for this interview.
A pleasure.